Hi, it's Louisa Dahl, and welcome to the Interactive Minds podcast, where I talk with passionate marketers, innovators, and digital leaders about their specific recipes for success. Welcome to the 50th episode of the Interactive Minds podcast. I thought this was a momentous occasion, and it's been exactly 1 year since we officially launched the podcast. So I wanted to do something a little bit different for this episode so that I can share with you some of the learnings I've discovered through the launch and growth of this channel. Let's get into it. Over the past few weeks, I've been thinking about the key learnings I've had from this podcast to share with you, and I've come up with 10 in total, which we'll get into soon. Before we get to that, though, I wanted to give you some background on why we launched the podcast in the first place and the original thinking so that you can also benefit from seeing how this has evolved. Being a planner, I have a whole folder filled with thoughts on the positioning and objectives of the podcast before I actually bit the bullet to launch it. So I wanted to share some of that with you first as a bit of background. The reasons I had for wanting to launch a podcast for Interactive Minds were pretty straightforward. I wanted to leverage audio as a new channel for my existing audience. I wanted to connect with marketers around the world and share their knowledge and insights, methods and learning with other marketers. And I also wanted to preempt speaker acquisition. So we spend a lot of time finding speakers to be part of our events. And I thought that by making new connections through the podcast, I might be able to ask some of those people to speak at events as well. And finally, I wanted to extend our brand. That's both my personal brand and the Interactive Minds brand. So I then went on to detail measures of success for the podcast as follows. The first one was around new connections and new relationships. The second one was how much time the business needs to spend on speaker acquisition moving forward. And the final one was how many interview guests can we get to come and speak at our events. All pretty straightforward. So if we start off by looking at those measures of success, well, in terms of new relationships, definitely it has helped me to build connection. It's given me a reason to connect with people I haven't spoken to in a while, and also a reason to reach out for people who might be doing interesting things so that I can build those new relationships. In terms of guests who have been involved in other areas of the business, I did a rough count, and at least 23 of our 49 guests to date have done something else with Interactive Minds, whether it be speak at an event, conduct a training session for our members, or been a member of the circle. So that's a really great outcome, and I'm really happy with those numbers. But of course, this is looking back at my original objectives, and nothing in marketing stays the same. So let's go through my learnings, and I'll share the evolution of the podcast as well. Some of the learnings I'm going to share are more tactical and about the efficiency of running a podcast, and some of them are more about strategy and the growth of a podcast. So to start off with, I'm going to do the efficiency related ones. So number one, having an interview structure helps you to be consistent and faster. Early on, I developed an interview framework that I use, and I've evolved a little bit as the show has gone on. It enabled me to have a bit of a case study vibe to the show because I was really eager to make sure that every interview had a bit of a purpose behind it so that we could share learnings and some takeaways for everyone. So I'm going to share with you what my structure is. It's actually 9 boxes on a piece of paper with headings, and I've got some questions under each heading, but I'm going to share the headings with you now. So I start off with an introduction to the guest. I ask them about their current role, that's box number 2. Then we talk about their goals. Then we talk about a case study topic. So what project are we talking about in particular? Who and how was involved in that? What the challenges were? What the results were? And what the learnings were? And then I finish with any other questions and wrap up. Pretty straightforward, but it's been really helpful to have questions related to each section and make sure I don't miss anything. All right, number 2 learning is line up guests well in advance. I found it's really valuable for me to spend a day booking in podcast guests for the next quarter and then not have to think about it, rather than doing bits and pieces and then putting guests under the pump to do a podcast quickly. So that's been really valuable if I can do it. It's something I still have to work on and make time for. Number 3, minimum prep is better for everyone. Initially, unless I knew the guest really well, I was trying to have a preparation call with them before the interview and then book in time for the actual interview. It wasn't until I got to around episode 23 with Noah Kagan and I asked him to book in these 2 times in his calendar, and he went, nah, let's just do it all at once. And it made me finally get brave enough to just do it in one call. Now, sometimes I do still have preparation calls, but I have realized that it's possible to do it without a big lot of prep beforehand, particularly for our guest. I always do define a rough topic with our guests by asking an area of interest or by asking them if there's a project they can talk about. But from there, I define some questions beforehand and I do a little bit of research as well. And I'm pretty much ready to go on that first call then with maybe a 5-minute prep space with the guest before we hit record. So that's been really useful and it's been a faster process for everyone. Number 4, I found it's easier to do things while the interview is still fresh. In the beginning, I tried to batch my interviews and I still do sometimes. So sometimes I do 2 interviews back to back in a day, but it means there's not a lot of time between them. Right at the beginning, I was having someone else do my show notes for me as well. So over time, I took these back on and I realized I was the best person to highlight areas of the interview that I wanted people to think about. So what that meant is I was doing my back-to-back interviews and then I would record the intro and outro and then I was leaving it at that, which meant I came back to the show notes days or even weeks later. So I've more recently discovered that if I just spend about 10 minutes directly after the show, I can interpret my notes, note down any links and learnings, and quickly save a version of the show notes, and sometimes even the graphics straight away, which saves me needing to completely re-listen to the episode before it goes live, and it's a faster process. All right, so now I'm going to move on to some of the strategy and promotion learnings that I've had from the podcast with number 5, and this is probably the biggest one of all. Working out how the podcast can really benefit the business. So this was something that I was always really conscious of. It actually took me 2 years to start the podcast in the first place because I wanted to make sure that the podcast could really benefit the business, but it has evolved. Now, there is no revenue associated with this podcast, which means it's a direct cost to the business for production, for hosting, and for, of course, my time. And it wasn't until earlier this year that I realized a few ways the podcast could benefit my business that I hadn't thought of before. And this was a real shift for me because I stopped thinking of my podcast as being primarily for our audience of marketers, and I started thinking of it as more of a tool for the business. So I had identified earlier that I thought the podcast could help me to find future speakers or connect with them, but I hadn't realized it might also help with some other pieces. So I realized that it was easier for me to ask someone to do a podcast interview with me than it was for me to ask them to deliver a training session for our membership audience. It's quicker to do a podcast interview. You don't need to do much prep, and it's simple and easy and it's done online and it's quick. So I started asking people to do podcast interviews first, and then for suitable people, sometimes I asked them to do a training session. And when I did it in this order, I found that I think everyone said yes. So then I've also since wondered if I interviewed people who might be more likely to join Interactive Minds as a member, or perhaps join Interactive Minds as a member of the Circle, which is our mastermind program, or someone who maybe might want their team members to do either of those two things. Would it be more likely if I build those relationships through podcasting rather than go in cold? This part is less tested as these memberships haven't been open, but it's definitely got me thinking a little bit differently. I also realised, particularly during COVID and lockdown times, that the podcast enabled me to continue connecting with my audience and to understand how they were doing and to make sure that I was still up to date with their problems and the opportunities to help them. So as you can see, this item is quite a big one, and it's probably been the biggest lesson and biggest leap in my podcasting approach. But let's keep going. Number 6. I'll keep the rest of them shorter, I promise. Don't expect to get loads of traffic from your existing audience. Sure, some of our event attendees and members of various programs that we run listen to podcasts, but not everyone is listening to marketing podcasts. So don't expect that you're going to just grow organically from your existing audience. Number 7, don't expect your guest to promote the episode for you. Some do, some don't. I think you really need to actually leverage people who are already listening to podcasts. And the best way that I've come up with to do this is to try and guest on other people's shows. It's definitely something I plan to do more of. Number 8, don't pay big bucks for producing. You can get a really good job of basic editing done for $40 to $60 in Australia per episode, and originally I was paying a lot more than that. Number 9, podcast hosts are a search engine like everything else. I'm talking here about iTunes, Spotify, Stitcher, etc. So set your podcast up to be found. I didn't do this until after launch. It was probably late last year when I added the words digital marketing to our podcast title. So now it's Interactive Minds Digital Marketing Podcast. And I try to use keywords in my episode titles more deliberately as well. From what I can tell, there is no direct science to being ranked by these search engines. So it's very much trial and error, but definitely helps, I think, if you think about that from the get-go. And number 10, Final one here. Don't lose momentum. We actually ran out of recorded episodes at one point, and a few weeks later when we did get back to restarting our weekly show, we noticed a drop in listens for each subsequent episode. I've also heard a friend of mine say the same thing about his podcast, so try and avoid breaks as much as possible and just keep getting the episodes out regularly. On this note, you may have noticed that I've started repurposing some audio content to add to my podcast. For example, I was on a panel discussion for someone recently and I asked them if I could share that audio in my podcast, and they said yes. I also shared an interview that I'd done at another event. It's a really good way to bring something different that's still relevant to your audience, and also to use the audio that you've got around you so that you can keep up the momentum with your show. So there you have it, my top 10 tips for podcasting and what I've learnt after 50 episodes. Above all, I think it's really important to make sure you enjoy what you're talking about. I personally have listened to some of my own interviews with the guests I've interviewed several times. And once you get over the cringe of listening to your own voice, you can really get value from your guests in this way. Hope you've enjoyed this episode. Thanks for listening. If you like this episode, please let me know. My recommended action item from today's show is to look at something you've done recently and think about what you've learnt. It's a therapeutic activity. Please join me in the Interactive Minds Facebook group where hundreds of marketers have discussions, answer questions, and I share the latest news I'm seeing in the industry. You can access today's show notes at interactiveminds.com/podcast. See you next week.